Okay, it's Friday and we're ready for history. We are on McKinley and the events in McKinley's presidency. Even though he was elected twice, we really only have 4 years that we're talking about because he was assassinated very early in his second term. So we see the his card here, and he's on the $500 bill. And then we also have one of his campaign posters here: prosperity at home and prestige abroad. Prestige is like a good name. And so that's um, what his poster is promoting. Tried to challenge myself a little bit last night to do a little bit more drawing. We talked about that last week, and I haven't really shared that much more. But I had a very large, just a face picture of McKinley, and I tried to do my best at drawing, and I'll share it with you. I think it turned out okay. So there's my portrait of McKinley, and I did one of Theodore Roosevelt too, but you're gonna have to wait for that one. I'll show you next time when we talk about him. I'm also reading a book that has a lot about him in it, and I'll share more about that later. Okay, let's get into McKinley's events. Okay, one of the biggest things that we should associate with his term is the Spanish-American War. So when I was talking about events toward the end of Cleveland's presidency, I mentioned to you that the newspapers were warring for people to buy their newspapers. And one of the ways that they did that was sensationalizing and making stories bigger than they actually were. And one of the things that they were using in this was what was going on in Cuba. So what happened in Cuba was that Cuba was governed by Spain. So the Spanish was the rulers, okay? Basically like before the revolution, when we were an English colony, that's the way that Cuba was. It was a Spanish colony. And they had an awful depression just like we did in 1893, I think 95, and they lost a lot of money, and so they revolted. They rose up against their rulers because of, and a lot of times when that happens, still even now, it's because of depression. When people don't have what they need or what they think they should have, they will revolt, and that means go against who's in charge. So, but when they did, okay, now think about the consequences. When you do that, it can be received in a couple of different ways, right? It can either be received and the leaders say, okay, we'll change, we see it your way, and the leaders there can be a change because of that, or we're going to put down this rebellion and you're going to know that we're in charge. Well, that's exactly how the Spanish reacted. They said, oh, no, 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 no. You're not going to revolt or rebel. We're going to show you who's boss. And they treated them very, very, very harshly. And that's what was making its way to the newspapers. Not necessarily that they weren't being treated harshly. They were. But that was all the newspapers were just putting it in. We're talking about it all the time, all the time, all the time. Can you see how media can play a part in what happens in the country? What the media chooses to talk about and chooses how to say it can make a difference. Think about even now. Reporters could cause a panic, or they could kind of help everyone and guide everyone and create a calm and a peace. And so it is important how our media does react. So newspapers were inciting this, though. They were trying to move people towards wanting a war. President McKinley did not want a war. He came in not wanting a war, wanting to stay away from war as much as possible. He was in the Civil War. He knew what war was. He knew how awful it was, how bloody it was, how many lives would be shed, and he didn't want that. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is a different story. He was the Secretary of the Navy at the time, and he did want war, and he had never been in a war, and somehow he felt like he was missing out. He had always wanted to be a soldier, and so he was in favor of this, in favor of going to war against the Spanish, in the favor of Cuba. Okay. But what does that mean if we do that? That means that now the United States is changing, because now it means that we can decide to get involved in another country's business. We've not really done that before, have we? We've kind of stayed to ourselves. Remember George Washington claiming neutrality? No, that's not our business. That's their business. They can take care of their own problems. We're over here. Well, the United States is growing more powerful and more powerful, and now we might be able to have the opportunity to get involved and help on someone else's behalf. And the question is, should we? Everybody has different opinions. I can't tell you the right answer on that one. You think about your own answer for that, okay? All right, so he didn't want to get involved in war, but he did send a battleship, the battleship Maine, very close to Cuba to kind of observe what was going on. Well, and it was kind of a show of force too. Like, we're ready to get involved if we need to. We're watching. We're here. It was kind of like a little bit of a warning. The battleship explodes, and more than 200 people were killed. There's an explosion on the battleship, I guess I should say. And more than about 250 people were killed. Well, what do you think the newspapers are going to say? Spain explodes our battleship, blah, 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 blah. But nobody knew. Many wanted to immediately blame the Spanish and say that they blew up our ship, and so now this is our reason to go to war. But we didn't know. We had no idea why it happened or if anyone caused it. Maybe it was just a problem on the ship. And so McKinley did put in more investigation to try to find out what was going on in the ship, and if we could figure out what the problem was. We never really did find out what it was, but there are a lot of people that thought that it was just that now it was just a problem that happened in something in the mechanics of the ship. But on April 11th, we're not far from that anniversary, are we? April 11th, 1898, McKinley did declare war. That began the Spanish-American War. Excuse me. History always makes me sneeze. So Theodore Roosevelt, at the moment, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigns. He says, I'm out of here. I'm going to war. This is what I've been waiting for. This is what my whole life has been leading up to. But instead of joining, he didn't join the Navy or anything. He got together his own group of people that he called the Rough Riders. And these were exactly what they sounded like, rough people. They didn't necessarily go along with military guidelines or the rules that everyone else did, but they were fighters. And so he leads his Rough Riders down to Florida and then into Cuba. This whole war only lasts until August 12th. So it started in April, ends in August. It wasn't very long. There were pretty few American casualties. And after the war, the Cubans were granted independence. Just ignore that. The Cubans were granted independence, and the U.S. took possession of the other Spanish colonies that they had: Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So now the United States is becoming what we call an imperial power. And that is why William McKinley is seen as one of the first modern presidents, because he is taking more control and more power into other parts of the world instead of just staying here. He's becoming more involved in the world. And that's how we see ourselves now, but that was not the way it was before him. It was just kind of about us. So now it's changing a little bit. So we have more properties now where we can extend power. Okay, meanwhile, in the country, here's what's going on. 1894, and you can look this up on YouTube. There's a little video you can see. It's the first motion picture, and it was Edison's. It was called a kinetoscope, but it was only on a little, like when you go to the park and you can look in those things and only one person can look in the viewer. Well, that's how his kinetoscope was. It was one person at a time, but it was a moving picture, and nobody had seen that before. And it was, the very first one was called Fred Ott's Sneeze. And guess what it was? Fred Ott sneezing. That's all it is. It lasts about a few seconds. But only one person could watch this moving picture at a time. A couple years later, some French brothers invent a movie projector, and then you're actually able to project the movie for more than one person to see at a time. But look at how one invention leads to another and leads to another. Then, in 1896, we have the Klondike Gold Rush. Gold is found in Canada and Alaska, and this is the largest gold rush in the United States. And boy, are we glad for Seward's folly now. Remember that? When Seward arranged for the purchase of Alaska? We're happy about that now, aren't we? Around this time, we also have the introduction of jazz music. This is something else you can get on and look up on YouTube. We have a man named John Philip Sousa who starts with like band music. He has big trumpets and brass instruments. Stars and Stripes Forever, the one that plays when we see the fireworks going. That's John Philip Sousa. But then black musicians take that kind of style of music and they start making it their own. And it starts in the New Orleans area and then becomes more and more popular. Okay, in 1898, Hawaii is annexed. Remember, Cleveland didn't want to do it. He thought we had done wrong to Hawaii and her queen and tried to restore government back to her. McKinley comes in, doesn't feel the same, and annexes Hawaii. So now we're growing into more of this imperial power like I talked about. In 1900, the U.S. had their eyes on China. Not to take over, but they wanted to be ready when they were ready to trade. And they didn't want all the other countries being able to do all the trading and U.S. being left out. We don't want to be left out of anything, okay? So we were trying for what's called an open door policy, meaning keep the door open and let us come in and trade, and you trade with us. But right about that time, a rebellious group called the Boxers rose up against all the foreigners that were living in China. And instead of the Empress deciding that she thought that was a bad idea, the Empress actually decided that was a good idea. And so she ordered the killing of all of the foreigners in China at the time. When the German minister was killed, it was like, this is a big deal. Everyone realized that this was serious. At the time, future President Herbert Hoover was living with his wife in China, and he was a minor, and they actually were in a compound with other Americans and helped protect them, and fought in this Boxer rebellion and tried to protect themselves. It, again, was short-lived, kind of like the Spanish-American War. It ended in August when there was a rescue force that captured Peking, which was the capital of China. So they captured Peking, and then the Boxer Rebellion ended, and Herbert Hoover and his wife were able to get out safely. Okay, there's a lot going on in this time, and guess what? We're into the 1900s. We're entering into the 1900s. So that's exciting. It feels more modern. You can see more of what we're used to starting to change and starting to happen. And it's interesting. Okay, it's interesting. What did I want to go back? Oh, I want your opinion. Okay? Now, like I said, there is no right answer, and everybody has their own opinions. I said that America is becoming more of an imperial power and we're getting involved in the business of other countries. What do you think? Should we mind our own business and not get involved in things in the world? Or should we keep our eyes on what's going on in the world and see where we can intervene and help or get involved? I'm not talking about as a person, I'm talking about as a country. As a country, should we stay to ourselves or should we get involved? And try to give me a reason that you have your opinion. All right, that's a tougher question. Think about it for a few minutes before you respond.